Access Reality. I'm Ali Kadili. We have Dr. Phillip Ball with us today. Dr. Ball did his undergraduate work in chemistry at the University of Oxford and got a PhD in physics. He's been an editor. He was an editor at Nature magazine for over 20 years, which, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most prestigious publications in science. And in fact, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say one publication in Nature can make an academic career. Dr. Ball is a prolific writer. He's also written for The Guardian, New York Times, and he produced a 3-part series on nanotechnology in BBC Radio 4. His last book is How to Grow a Human, Adventures in Who We Are and How We Are Made. His book before that in 2018 was Beyond Weird, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Quantum Physics is Different. So thank you very much for being here, Dr. Ball.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right, that's great. So when someone looks at your profile, I think they find something very remarkable, which is the interdisciplinary nature of your work and your path. I mean, you've written about physics, biology, chemistry, history, art. I think that by and large, when you look at the whole landscape of science and art, that is not a common quality or commodity. Would you agree with that?
The sense that someone sort of encompasses both, you mean, or that writes about both of those areas?
Correct. We'll approach a problem pulling in two different fields or two different perspectives. It's usually physics people stay in physics, let's say.
I guess it's true, and it always saddens me that that's the case. And I think that's something that the structures of academia in particular encourage, but I think it's actually something that the structures of our education system encourage as well, that we learn from a very early stage that knowledge is divided up into these different disciplines with clear boundaries between them. And one of the things I always try to do when I sometimes talk to school children of all ages, and I'm very keen to try to make it clear to them that those divisions are matters of convenience, that actually understanding stuff, doesn't fall into those neat categories, those neat distinctions. And in fact, it's really a conscious choice that I've made since I've been a writer, and increasingly made, to try to find areas, topics that not only go between scientific disciplines, but that go, from science to the humanities, and really that all of this is part of our culture, part of our cultural heritage. And I think that's really what I try to convey in what I write, that to fully understand a subject like color or invisibility, so those are two of the topics of books that I've written about, it's no good approaching ideas like that from the point of view of a particular science, or even from just science itself. Generally, you've got to take in the whole of culture and weave the science into the rest of culture. So I consciously set out to try to do that in what I write.
Yeah, I think that maybe when you're a writer or a freelancer, or it might be possible to do that, but the problem is by the time people reach that point in their career, throughout their formation, they've already been forced to think in a confined way. Like I know people who have PhDs or want to do postdocs and who have an interest in pulling in, let's say, just one other discipline with what they're doing. And they're actively discouraged from that because whoever's supervising them isn't really comfortable with that idea.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's actually a problem that has got worse in recent years. In the sense that, young academics, young people going into academic research have a tremendous pressure to get on as quickly as possible and to produce as quickly as possible, which means that they have to become, incredibly specialized in a very short space of time to make an impact in that field, and really have no opportunity and no time, and as you say, no encouragement to look beyond that. It's actually why, one reason why I didn't stay in research myself. I did a PhD in physics, and I figured that when I came to the end of it, I had the potential to stay within physics and stay within research, but I could see that that would be an ever narrowing path. And I think for some of the people who I studied alongside, I can see that they are still working in, related areas to the ones that they began in decades ago. So, I think it's very, very hard to break out of that. Very often the scientists who do that they only do so at the end of their career, where they have the luxury of doing that. If they've made their name within their field, perhaps they have the luxury of branching out. But I think that for young researchers, it's extremely difficult to do that. And I think that's a real problem. It's a real problem for science, because some of the biggest challenges facing us are ones, and facing scientists are ones that aren't going to be solved from within the tram lines of any particular discipline. And there's a big move, these days, at least in terms of the way people talk about things, there's a big support for the notion of interdisciplinarity, of disciplines collaborating. And I'm all for that, and I think it's a great thing. But I think, what often tends to happen when you get those collaborations is that the scientists find they speak a different language. They seem to be talking about the same thing, and then they discover that actually they're talking about something different because they have different understandings of the same word. So, I think this is a problem that potentially holds back science, that there is this encouragement to specialize, to become very narrow very quickly. It's not something, of course, that existed in science in the past. And I really hope that science will find ways of loosening those constraints in the future.
Yeah, it's why the world hasn't produced many Leonardo da Vinci's since his time.
Well, it's often said that this division, the whole division between the sciences and the humanities, or between science and art, that's something that began around the time of the Renaissance, and certainly wouldn't have made any sense to someone like Leonardo. I mean, one has to say Leonardo was a one-off. There aren't many Leonardos that come along, but I think there is some truth in that notion, and I think it was particularly in the 19th century when disciplines really started to become formalized that you see not just this growing division between the humanities and the arts and the sciences, but also growing divisions between different branches of science itself. So it's absolutely true. I think it's important to recognize that there are some good reasons why that has happened, because these days there is just so much knowledge. It's so difficult to stay abreast, for any scientist to stay abreast even of what is happening in their own field. In fact, most scientists say they can't do that. There is just so much activity, so much to be learned, and we frankly we know so much more in science than we did 300 or 400 years ago. There is just too much to be held in one mind. So it's understandable to some extent that this happens. But I guess I don't see that necessarily has to lead to this kind of siloing of science. And I think it's certainly possible to try to find ways of having more dialogue between the sciences, so that any scientist has some idea of what is going on outside their field. And I think the scientists who do that, the best scientists who have that kind of breadth, make it very plain that that's actually a positive thing for their science. This isn't just about learning about other things because it's good for you. It actually feeds back into their own research to have that broader view of what's going on outside. And it's very often the case in the history of science that some of the best ideas, some of the most fertile ideas, have entered into a field from outside, from people who, look at a problem within a field, but look at it with an outsider's eye, and so see things that specialists don't necessarily see.
Yeah, the response of some academic institutions to this, who have to their credit recognized this, is they've produced departments of multidisciplinary studies or interdisciplinary studies. You can even get degrees in those things. But the actual sciences, arts, everything else are still siloed. And you have this one department. And to me, in my opinion, it has been an ineffective approach.
Yeah.
What you need is the the people in those proper disciplines themselves having an more open mind or collaborative approach. What is the solution to some of this, do you think?
I wish
There
I
is none,
knew. I
is there?
think a lot of people wish they knew. If I did, then I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing probably. I think it's certainly not as easy as saying, well, everyone just has to be broad and has to learn everything. Not only because that's impossible, but also because really science can only make progress by having people who have an incredibly deep knowledge in what then necessarily has to be a narrow area. We absolutely do need specialists. So I don't think, although there are experiments, and I think brave and interesting experiments in trying to find more interdisciplinary ways of teaching science, I do think I do have a lot of sympathy for the people who say, well, in the end, you've got to have depth of knowledge. If you have breadth, that's there may be some value in that, but you're not going to really solve the some of the hardest questions in these disciplines. So we do need that, but I think it's more about about encouraging a kind of mindset. I think that part of that solution is finding ways to lessen these ridiculous actually pressures that young scientists have on them now to produce stuff very quickly. Often they say there's so much pressure to produce and to publish, to get results and to publish, we don't actually have time to think. I think that's one of the things I hear again and again from practicing scientists, particularly young ones. No time to think, no time to step back and just ponder on some of the broader questions in an area. So I think if there are ways of lessening the pressures of academia in that sense, pressures to publish, pressures to produce results, that would just give a bit of breathing space for people to be a little more broad. I think it is very good that there are these experiments in trying to bring different disciplines together to create interdisciplinary research institutes where people can talk to each other. I know that sometimes results from those kinds of experiments have been mixed. That it still seems to be very hard to resist the tendency of people to just drift into their own little groups, their own clusters of people who think the same way. That's life, right? So, but I think that it's those are things that are worth experimenting with. But I think it's also partly about just recognizing, perhaps today more than ever, that the big questions we face are ones that aren't disciplinary questions. I think that's very evident at the moment, right, with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not something that epidemiologists will solve, or that virologists will solve, or immunologists will solve. And in fact, even those particular sciences need to be informed by and aware of social sciences, and increasingly of the political realities of the situation they're operating within. So, we have absolutely around us at the moment, in an awful kind of way, a very clear demonstration of why we need people who can go between disciplines and bring different disciplines together. And I think, maybe that's part of the key, that not everyone will do this. In fact, most people won't have this breadth. But if we can find ways of encouraging some individuals who have that capacity and have the desire to do that, then we need to make sure we can nurture those people as well.
I think that's the key, because as you said, I feel that it's a byproduct of the advance in science and the subspecialization. So you want to maintain that, but at the same time, for those who have the mind or the intellectual capacity to, maybe they just think in a different way, to bring in different perspectives, why shut them out?
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of of what that entails is rethinking the reward structures for science. At the moment, there's really just one, that you have to try and publish papers that, and if they get highly cited and you get a good sort of citation index and so on, then you're considered to be succeeding. But we need more than that. And there's in some areas of science or in amongst some people, there is a recognition that actually individuals who are able to bring together groups and manage those groups really well, but don't necessarily publish themselves or even produce fantastic work themselves, they're really, really valuable. We really need people like that. Technical skills that don't necessarily lead to publications, but that might help to develop new techniques that might be of use to a broad range of people. Those are really vital skills also to have in science. And so we need ways of rewarding people with those sorts of skills that aren't just contingent on how much they're publishing and what the impact factor of their papers is.
Yeah, now you mentioned now a few times the pressure to publish and how that's the only metric now that's really used in the academic and research world. Is that not a function of just how competitive things have gone? I mean, to put it quite bluntly, there's too many people in a discipline with too few positions. And I see this all the time where it's rare for someone to cross to the other side to get a position, let's say a tenure track or anything like that. And then you have this army of people who will just keep doing postdocs and and then if they happen to publish in Nature or Science, then they might go through. But isn't it like, is it too many people doing this? Is that the problem?
Well, it's a curious situation because you have, I think that is a possibility that we really have to think about. Whether we do have overproduction. Looking historically at different disciplines, there have been times when you can say in retrospect, there has been overproduction of specialists, and there are fluctuations in the same way as there are in economics, in markets. But at the same time, you hear concerns from universities that not enough people are choosing to study X, are going into chemistry or are, going into engineering or something. So that can be a problem too. And you see closure of departments, which means that an academic institution loses that whole kind of area and the potential for that area to fertilize other areas. You need diversity in academic institutions. So you have both of these things going on at the same time. As someone who isn't an academic and isn't fully embedded in that system, I have the luxury of being able to see those things happening, but also the lack of knowledge to really know what is going on, how best to think about that, and how best to manage that. But I think that it does. All of these problems seem to suggest that we haven't necessarily or at all times got it right in terms of the somehow guiding the fluxes of people into different disciplines, depending on the demand for that discipline, we certainly don't seem to have it sorted in terms of how to support the career development in those disciplines. And I sort of feel like one of the problems there is that there is just this one way to do it, that as you say, you do a PhD and then you get a postdoc and then you try to get tenure and so on. And there are reasons why that structure exists, but more and more people have have varied needs. That structure in particular, it's long been clear that structure makes it very hard for female researchers in the early stages of their career. And there are all sorts of reasons why that is so, that can be talked about separately. But the fact is that there's a burden that falls on female researchers in particular, with that pattern that we need to think about, and whether there are ways that we can increase the flexibility. But I think, quite generally for anyone, it would be useful to have more flexibility in how you can develop your career as a scientist. And I think that's also a way potentially to make sure that there's a greater diversity of people, of ways of thinking within science, which is also very important. You know, you don't just need the people who are very focused and able to do their PhD and, you know, follow a very clear path through academia.
Perfect. There you go. We just solved that massive problem. So
Let's hope so.
yeah. All right. So I wanted to go over the book before your last, and the title there included the statement, "Why everything you thought you knew about quantum physics is different." Can you just summarize what are the concepts that people talk about in terms of quantum physics that are actually not true?
Right.
Like, so the conclusions they come to, and, you know, it becomes kind of a dictum that, you know, it means there are many worlds. It means this, it means that. Like, which ones of those do you feel are inaccurate, that are commonly?
Well, I mean, first of all, maybe I should say, you know, that was the motivation for writing this book. And it was sort of curious compared to most of my other books, in that it was one that I felt almost this kind of responsibility descending on me to have a go at writing this book, because, you know, I could have thought at that stage there are lots of popular books about quantum mechanics, and, you know, plenty of them are very good, so does the world really need another one? And I would have, you know, 5 years ago, before I wrote this book, I would have thought, no, probably not. But I found myself, for one reason or another, writing a series of short articles for various scientific publications, and as I did so, the more I delved into what the work that is being done in quantum mechanics today, in the sort of fundamentals of quantum mechanics, trying to understand, you know, how quantum mechanics really sort of works, the more I realized that the habitual ways we talk about it, and by we, I don't just mean we science writers, although partly that, I mean also often scientists talking about their subject, that these habitual ways are kind of wrong. I mean, you know, some of them are flat out wrong. Some of them are simply misleading. Some of them are misrepresenting what quantum mechanics is really saying. But we've come to sort of rely on them just as a quick and easy and familiar way, and we don't really think about them. And one of those is to do with the notion of quantum superposition. And this is often talked about as one of the curious things about quantum mechanics is that objects described by quantum mechanics, so particles and atoms and so on, that they can exist in two states at once. And, you know, this is one of the things that makes it so different from the classical world, where, you know, my coffee cup is either here or there. It can't be here and there. And, you know, I'd use this phrase that that's what a superposition means over and over again. But actually, once I really started to think and to look, you know, at what people who are very careful about what quantum mechanics is telling us, what they say about this, it became clear that that's not really the right way to talk about a quantum superposition. What it really means, if an object is placed in a superposition, then it means that if we make some observation of that object, some measurement to try to find out what state it's in, what it's like, what its property is, then several answers are possible. Several results of that observation are possible. Okay, so, you know, if I, with my coffee cup, it's in a certain position. If I measure that position by looking at it, that's a kind of measurement. It's always going to be there. You know, there's no chance that it's going to be on the other side of my desk unless I've put it there to begin with. Whereas, you know, a coffee cup, let's say in a superposition, when I look at it, I might find it here or I might find it there. Before I look, this is really the crucial thing, before I look, it's not the case, or at least quantum mechanics doesn't tell us that it's the case, that it's somehow in both places at once. The crucial thing is quantum mechanics doesn't tell us what it is like before I look. Quantum mechanics tells us about the outcomes of measurements. It tells us what we are going to see if we make a measurement. And generally, it tells us that in terms of probabilities, there's a 50% chance it will be here, there's a 50% chance it will be there, for example. So it became more and more clear to me that actually quantum mechanics doesn't permit us to say what something is like before we look. There are various interpretations of the theory that people make that say things about that, but actually those are just interpretations. They're not something that's part of the theory. So the way I express it is that really quantum mechanics is a theory not of isness, but of ifness. So the questions we ask are ones that aren't saying, what is this system like? What is happening here? It's a kind of theory that says, if we do this, then we might find this. If we look at this object, then we will find with a 50-50 probability that it's in this state or in that state. And so, we need to ask if questions. And that's really what, in my mind, makes quantum mechanics such an unusual scientific theory. Because in science, we're used to scientific theories telling us about what the world is like, regardless of whether we look or not. And this has always been the curious thing about quantum mechanics, that, we're not sure what it says about what the world is like. But we can use it with great accuracy, incredible accuracy, to predict what will happen if we look at it, if we make a measurement. So I think that's the key idea that I wanted to try to get across in this book.
So does that reveal fundamentally that we don't understand the actual state that whatever we're trying to measure is in? Like, we think of it, we're limited by what we can measure and see. So we think of things as particles or discrete particles with a discrete mass in a discrete location. And when something doesn't exist in that nature, when it's rather a cloud of probability or energy or a wave that we can't quite pinpoint with our measurements, and then when you do measure it, you affect it and change it, and you get different outcomes depending on how and when you measure. Is that leading to somebody coming up with the misconception that, that means, it's in different places at the same time, depending on how I measure it or how I look at it? Because we're not understanding what it actually is at.
I mean, you could say it's not understanding that issue, but I guess I feel like it really raises questions about what we mean by understanding, because there are some people who will say, no, quantum mechanics tells us all we need to know and all we can expect to know. Every time we use quantum mechanics to make a prediction about what we are going to see, it works. We see exactly what we've predicted. That prediction might be, well, you'll see this or that with 50-50 probability. And then we make lots of measurements and we find, yeah, actually, like tossing a coin, once you've made enough, you see exactly that. It's one or the other. And we can't tell each time which we're going to see. But, if we do enough measurements, we'll see that quantum mechanics is predicted the outcomes perfectly. But I think what interested me there, Ali, is that you were saying, well, so does that mean that if the quantum system is this sort of cloud of probabilities, that we don't quite understand what it means? What I'm saying is, that's the language we always use out of habit, that the quantum system is this or it is that. And actually, quantum mechanics doesn't permit us to say what it is before we look. Now, it's easy to misunderstand that. And I think some people think that, what you're saying is, there is no reality. There is nothing there until we look, kind of thing. And I'm not saying that. And I think that the people who thought more deeply than me about quantum mechanics wouldn't say that either. There are people who believe that actually there is some sort of fundamental reality that we just can't access, or that quantum mechanics doesn't tell us about. And that may be true. That is a possibility. The more we've studied quantum mechanics experimentally, particularly in the last several decades, the more it's looked like that's not the case. It seems harder and harder to make that case, that actually there are, everything really is a certain way. It's just that we can't get at it. But, that's still a possibility. That still hasn't been completely ruled out. That was certainly the view that Albert Einstein took of quantum mechanics, that it was incomplete, that there was something more that, fixed the way things were that we just couldn't get at. But I think what really quantum mechanics seems to say at the moment, in my mind, is that regardless of whether there is or isn't something concrete to be said about this, the way things are before we look. Quantum mechanics isn't going to tell us that. Quantum mechanics is a theory, is a kind of machinery for telling us what to expect when we look at something, and it's silent about about what gives rise to those observations. But that absolutely doesn't mean that there is no reality. It simply means quantum mechanics isn't the theory that will get us there. And as you say, some people, there are all sorts of ways of trying to understand it. And for some people, they will say, well, the way to understand this sort of probabilistic nature and the fact that we can't tell if we will get this or that out of it when we make the measurement is that all of those things happen. It's just that when they do, some kind of splitting happens, so that we only see one of them, but in another world, another one of us sees another. So that's the many worlds idea. And on paper, that's an argument that you can make a case for. One of the things I argue in the book, in general, I try to be sort of certainly non-dogmatic about about what these different interpretations that people have put forward. But I find that some seem more persuasive and some seem more problematic than others. And the many worlds interpretation, to my mind, seems more problematic. There are many questions about it that we don't really know how to answer. And if we really think them through, if we really think through what it means to have this splitting of reality, if you like, that different versions of ourselves go into, if we really think that through, it seems to me that it becomes something that is actually unthinkable, inconceivable. It's not possible to talk coherently about it. Whether or not that means that we have to rule it out is a matter of opinion. Some people say, well, so what? Why should it be interpretable and comprehensible or even coherent to us? But to my mind, a scientific theory kind of has to be if it's going to be useful. So that's really my the problem that I have with the many worlds idea.
Isn't it a much simpler kind of idea? Is that there is something there. It's real, obviously, because we see the effects in terms of the quantum world. But we just cannot measure it or understand it with the tools that we have, with our five senses, with our machinery, with the photons that we put. Like, we just cannot. And that's why we don't get discrete measurements that we understand and deal with in our everyday lives.
Well, I think it seems to me that the question really comes down to, is this about a lack of information about things that we just can't get to about the world, or is it something fundamental about the world, that there is this fundamental sort of unknowability to the world? That's really the crucial question. And I think all the interpretations of quantum mechanics speak to that question of which of those things it is. And one of the ways that I have found most useful really to think about this, how to phrase this problem, is in terms of quantum information theory, which is has become a very popular way of thinking about quantum mechanics in the past several decades, partly because it's tied it to the whole idea of quantum computation. And we now have quantum computers of a kind that can do real sort of calculations using these ideas of quantum information. And the way I, at the moment, sort of like to think about it, it makes sense to me, is to say that it may be that the world at the most fundamental level simply cannot contain enough information to deliver clear answers to every question we can think of asking the world. That actually, this is the thing we've become used to in our classical world. We've become used to thinking science can ask any question and ultimately we can get an answer, and it will, the world will deliver us an answer to that question. And it's generally that's been the case, so we have good reason to think that we could just keep on doing that again and again at finer and finer details, asking questions and expecting to get definite answers. But if it's the case that, and some people have sort of postulated it in these terms, if it's the case that actually whatever this fundamental stuff of the universe is, it can't encode enough information to deliver answers to every question we could think of asking. If that's the case, then the result would be a world like the quantum world that we find. You know, that's one way of thinking about it, that actually there just isn't enough information that a system can hold fundamentally to always give us a definite answer to a question. And, you know, when there isn't enough, then what remains when we ask that question, the outcome is random. You know, because there is just simply not enough information to fix a definite outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a possible way to look at it when we don't have answers. But I mean, fundamentally, you have an underlying world or reality there in that quantum world. And my contention would be that we just don't have the tools to perceive it, because we operate in this classical physical world, our five senses, the things that we have to measure and look at things, which is applying energy to them, or photons bouncing off of them so we could see something or measure something. We just don't have the tools. We're not equipped. We don't live or deal in that world. It's against our intuition, our senses, our understanding, our experiences. We just are not equipped at this point to make sense of that, but it's there.
Well, here's one way of looking at it. If we go back to this idea of superpositions, so we let's imagine we take a quantum particle and we put it in a superposition of states where it's either, to speak in computer terms, where the state of that system will either be, if we measure it, will either be a 1 or a 0. Okay, and then the question is, you know, if we, at the moment, we make those measurements and we might see 1s and 0s coming out 50-50, you know, the 50-50 chance in a series of measurements. And the question then is, you know, for any one of those measurements, is there some way that we could get at, before we make that measurement, you know, is there some way we could tell what the measurement would give us? Now, you know, of course, that then you get into a regress. You can say, well, how will you know that without making a measurement? But that's really what the question is. You know, is there, does that particle already, is it either a 1 or a 0? And that, you know, in principle, there might be some way of finding that out before we make the normal measurement that we do. That's really the question. And some people think, yes, there is. But at the moment, every experiment we've done seems to suggest that, that there isn't. There is no way of telling whether it's going to be a 1 or a 0 until we make the measurement. And, you know, if that's the case, then it seems to me the only way we can really think about that is to say, you know, that information doesn't exist in reality until we make the measurement. You know, that is not a component of reality. This was certainly Niels Bohr, the Danish pioneer of quantum mechanics. This was his position, that, you know, that question, you know, well, what was it like before we make the measurement, is talking about something that is not a component of reality. And I guess it seems to me that that may be a possibility that we have to entertain. And so far, in fact, quantum mechanics seems to be telling us it really is a possibility. In fact, you know, that seems to be how things are. And there are ways, you know, clever ways of probing that, of kind of, you know, trying to find out if there was a pre-existing answer or not. And when we've made experiments to try to sort of probe that question, it seems to us to give a clear answer of no, that, you know, there really wasn't a pre-existing answer. It really did only come into being when we made the measurement. So, you know, it goes against all our intuitions that this should be so. But this is really what I'm driving at, that in a situation like that, it may be that it's because that particle, it wasn't capable of holding that information. It didn't have the capacity to be either a 1 or a 0 beforehand. You know, the only information that it could contain is, well, is information that specifies when you make the measurement, you're going to get one or the other.
So if it didn't have the capacity to hold that information, Yet it did when we measured it. So the act of us measuring it gave it that quality.
Mm-hmm.
That would still mean that before we measured, there was something there, but we're not able to assess what that something is, because with our crude tools, when we measure, we produce the binary things that you talked about.
Yeah.
So we're not fundamentally then understanding what it really is.
Well, you see, that's really the question that and that is language, what it fundamentally really is. Perhaps at the fundamental level, it's not an is world, it's an if world. That really you could say, perhaps it's the case that you could say, well, what that thing fundamentally is some kind of entity that will reveal either a 1 or a 0 when we make a measurement. And perhaps that is the sum total of what we can say about it, of what it is meaningful to say about it. In fact, that is perhaps the sum total of the description of the reality of that entity. Okay, that's really the question. Do we have to stop there at saying, well, that's, it's not only for practical terms as good as we can do, it's actually all there is that could be meaningfully said about that particle. Is that the case? Or is there something more that underlies that? And we simply don't know the answer to that. But it's important to make clear that's not denying that there was that there was something there before we looked. It's just that we don't have not just we don't have the language or we don't have the knowledge, but perhaps we cannot speak. It is not meaningful to speak about what the nature of that thing was before we looked.
Okay. But either way, there's something there that is underlying something else, underlying a reality that we do know and see. Is that the concept that gave rise to the hypothesis of a holographic or a simulation universe? Is that where that came from? That there's some energy producing something else that we then see and feel and touch?
It's well, the idea of the holographic universe, and I certainly don't consider myself an expert on this. Quantum mechanics is a part of it, but it's something more than that, and it's a speculative idea, but an absolutely fascinating one, and it really comes out of the mathematics of considering the problem in a certain way, because mathematically it has been proved possible to show that it's really making a connection between quantum mechanics and the theory of general relativity. And this is the big challenge that underlies a lot of fundamental questions in physics. I'm not going to say it's the biggest question in physics, because physics is much more than this, but it's a really tantalizing and challenging problem, how to unite general relativity, which describes on the whole things on a very big scale and describes gravity, with quantum mechanics, which on the whole describes things at a very small scale. And one of the ideas that came out of probing the mathematics of general relativity suggested that within a certain kind of description of a relativistic description of space and time in a certain kind of universe, and in general this has really only been sort of shown for universes that don't look quite like ours, that actually have a slightly different sort of gravity to ours, but related. The mathematics of that looks like the mathematics that describes the boundary to that system, that space, at the quantum mechanical level. That if you describe the quantum mechanics of that boundary space, it looks like the quantum mechanics of the space-time that's inside it. And so, in some sense, the idea is then that that space-time is a kind of projection into that three-dimensional space of, well, if we think about three-dimensional space, it's a kind of projection of the two-dimensional boundary that's surrounding it, described quantum mechanically. And so there is this connection, this apparent connection between the two kinds of mathematical descriptions So that's really what the holographic universe is talking about. That you know, the universe we see is almost like there's a sort of holographic projection of it onto the boundary of it that we can describe in quantum mechanical terms. So it's a fascinating idea. It is still speculative. There is absolutely no proof that this is the way things are. But if there is some truth in it, then it seems to establish something about this elusive connection between the theory of general relativity and the theory of quantum mechanics.
Well, to me, when you first hear it, I just thought it was kind of a fantastical, kind of a childish, it's a lazy way out. Oh yeah, it's just a holograph, or it's just but when you look at some of the discrepancies that we cannot seem to resolve, then kind of it's a good placeholder as an explanation. Like when you can't explain the differences between, let's say, the quantum world and the world that we see and measure and operate in, then you think, okay, well, theoretically that could be, maybe it's a projection based on that reality, meaning the quantum reality is the real, so to speak, reality, and this is just a projection of that. That's one thing. The other thing is, as you know, with your background in chemistry and physics, that most atoms or matter seems to be made out of space. So how can then we see it and deal with it as if it's solid? Does that also lend credence to the idea?
Well, I mean, I think it's, that's a fair way to put it, that it's, you could see it as a sort of space holder idea, I suppose. But it's, it's not the only one. And I think, it's certainly true that the important thing to recognize about it is that it's not just someone thinking, well, maybe it's this. It does come out of the mathematics. But some of that mathematics is speculative mathematics that, as it stands, doesn't describe the world we live in, but describes something that's a bit like it. So, it's important to recognize that it's a speculative idea, but it's drawn a lot of interest from some areas of the fundamental physics community because it seems to offer a possible way forward, a possible way to explore things. And in terms of what it says about the world we experience, the fascinating thing is that it seems to suggest that space-time, which we space and time, which we experience as a kind of a thing. We have this notion that there is space, there is separation between things, there are distances between things. It's actually saying that's not the fundamental thing. The fundamental thing is a quantum property called entanglement, which relates to the way the properties of one quantum particle can be dependent on another quantum particle, in a way that seems to disregard the space between them, the separation between them, so that in a sense, sometimes quantum entanglement is talked about as though, if you do something to one of those particles, instantaneously it's felt by the other. Actually, the better way to see it is to say that those two particles, if they're entangled, they're in some sense the same quantum entity. Even though they might be spatially, light years apart, they're somehow the same entity, and space just seems to kind of vanish out of the equation in that case. And the idea is that that actually space-time arises from this kind of entanglement between the particles that make it up. And that's, it's a completely fascinating, mind-boggling idea. That's, if in a sense, it's sort of suggesting that space-time is not exactly an illusion, but what is sometimes called an emergent property of this more fundamental thing, which is quantum entanglement.
But that's what I mean by, it seems to fly in the face of everything we know, everything we've experienced, everything that our intuition and senses tell us. So that's what I meant by, is there some kind of hidden underlying reality out there that we just don't have access to because we're stuck in this kind of projection of that, which isn't real, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I guess I think it's, I think, almost undoubtedly, even perhaps even sort of tautologically the case that there must be You know, because we know that the description of reality that we have goes down as far as quantum mechanics and doesn't go beyond, but there must be something beyond. Because as far as we can tell, you know, there are many, there are smaller scales of space and time that we don't have a theory of. It was pointed out to me recently, I mean, it's a kind of obvious thing that we, you know, if we believe quantum mechanics is sort of fundamentally telling us anything, then it seems to be suggesting that we can meaningfully think about spatial scales going down to something like, well, what's often called the Planck scale. So, you know, something like, I guess it's 10 to the minus 34 meters, or if I remember rightly. But, you know, we only have access to something down to the size of atoms, or, you know, slightly smaller. So something like, you know, 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 11, 10 to the minus 12. You know, so that means there's a you know, a trillion orders of magnitude really of spatial scales, you know, between that smallest possible length scale of the Planck scale and the ones that we can see, and the same with time. Now, if we scale that up, you know, if we think about sort of having a view of the universe, or, you know, the galaxy or whatever, but just on that kind of, you know, on a trillion orders of magnitude bigger than the ones that we experience, we wouldn't even see, we wouldn't see humans, we wouldn't see anything that happens on Earth. It would be gone. It would be, you know, it would be, we couldn't even resolve it. So how much are we missing about reality in not having access to all that stuff between the, you know, the smallest scales that seem possible and the ones that we can actually see? Nobody knows. And of course, this is one of the, you know, this is the question that ideas like string theory are trying to get at. But they're all speculative, and they, you know, we don't have any direct empirical access to them. So, you know, it could be that the reality that we see is just some kind of, you know, hugely sort of crude averaging out of all kinds of stuff, all kinds of phenomena that are going on at scales below what we can experience and see.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, it certainly seems that with quantum mechanics, it seems to be on the surface about size. The fact that the rules don't apply once you get to that small size. And then likewise, as you said, it seems like, does your intuition, because I know there's no way to scientifically know this, but do you feel that we just are operating in a medium kind of world on the scales that we understand, the sizes and scales that we understand, and that the rules that we know, the classical mechanics, apply to that? And then, as you said, once you go beyond that or below that, who knows what other realities are there, and who knows, and you know, these rules certainly don't apply there.
Well, yeah, I absolutely think that. I mean, it's almost necessarily the case, right? Because, you know, this is what we know. And this is exactly what I mean when I talk about the fact that we have this kind of is language that we expect, you know, answers to what something is like, because that's what the classical world, you know, expects us to, leads us to believe. But another of the things that I wanted to bring out in my book on quantum mechanics is that this isn't some kind of weird divide between the quantum world and the classical world, you know, that one runs by a certain set of rules and one runs by another. The more we have come to understand about quantum mechanics, particularly in the last sort of 2 or 3 decades, the more I think it has become clear that the classical world that we know at these scales, at human scales, is exactly what you would expect quantum mechanics to look like at that level. You know, we have not complete, but a much better understanding of how it is that the classical world, that classical physics comes out of quantum mechanics. So, you know, that's really, I mean, I say it in the book in terms of saying, you know, it's quantum all the way up. It's just that this, you and me and what's around us, are what quantum mechanics looks like if you're 6 feet tall. So I think that that's going to be, I feel fairly confident that that's going to be increasingly the case, that we're going to think, oh, you know, there never was this quantum classical divide. This is simply, you know, how quantum mechanics plays out at these, you know, bigger scales.
Does the holographic simulation hypothesis negate the need to unify and to come up with a unifying explanation that encompasses quantum mechanics with classical Newtonian mechanics and Einstein's theory of relativity, because you don't need to unify them because you're just calling it a projection or a holographic simulation? Is that a cop-out in a way?
I don't think it, I wouldn't see it as that way. See it in that way. I think that it is actually an attempt to unify the two and to try to offer a description for how space-time, with the properties that general relativity says it has, and you know, it seems that seems to be borne out, that a space-time of that nature it can come out of quantum mechanics. It's an attempt to explain, again, you know, in a similar sort of way, if you like, how that can be the case, how space-time at the scale of cosmology, you know, that the properties it has perhaps are the ones that we would expect if fundamentally quantum mechanics is pulling the strings. So that's really what it's trying to do. I think it is trying to actually unify those two descriptions. But you know, again, I don't want to. I can't stress enough that it's a speculative idea, that there is no evidence that it's right. It's a very, in some ways, you know, it feels like a very beautiful idea, and I'm often a bit wary about calling things beautiful in physics, because I think sometimes that can mislead. But I think that it really is very, very striking, but it may be completely wrong. So we just don't know.
Now I know that you're not a fan of the many worlds idea, or the multiverse, or the infinite universes. Can you tell us what a valid argument for that would be? Can you play devil's advocate and tell us why the people who advocate that believe in it?
Well, yes, I mean, I completely understand the motivation for believing in it, because, you know, there has been this, I suppose one way of thinking about the problem is that when we think about a superposition, it seems there are two possible outcomes. You know, let's say, I mean, there could be more. There are two or more possible outcomes of an observation of a quantum object that we can make if that object is in a superposition. So, you know, in a sense, it looks as though there's some measure of reality to both of those possibilities, but we only get one when we look. And the question is, where does the other one go to? And you know, one of the most problematic things about that process of looking is that the equations of quantum mechanics tell us everything happens smoothly, that you know, that things change smoothly over time in a sort of wave-like way. But the description that has often been of necessity sort of used to understand what happens when we make a measurement is one where there's a sudden change. Suddenly, as we make the measurement, you know, we get one outcome and the other one has vanished. And that is a description that in mathematical terms doesn't have that smoothness. It's the technical term is that it's a non-unitary process. And quantum, that's not part of quantum mechanics as currently formulated. So, you know, it seems to violate what the quantum equations tell us happens. So that's really the worry that you know, that has been around. And what the many worlds suggests is that that problem goes away, that non-unitary behavior when we make a measurement goes away if we make the if we make the assumption that in making that measurement both outcomes are possible, then that is then a unitary process, and you get that sort of splitting of worlds so that both outcomes are actually observed, but in different universes. And mathematically, if we just think about a single particle and being measured, mathematically you can sort of you can formulate quantum mechanics in a way that seems to suggest that both of those outcomes actually occur and everything stays unitary. There is there is none of this sort of abruptness that the theory doesn't already have in it. So that's the reason for the many worlds, that it's a kind of a way of, if you like, saving the maths from this ugliness, from this sort of ad hoc way of getting from the description before in a superposition to the description after when you've made a measurement. And I can understand the why that was proposed and why people find that more elegant. There are questions even at that fundamental level of what then we can possibly understand by probability, because what we then have to, if we believe in many worlds, we then have to say, well, here I have this object that I placed in a superposition. When I make a measurement on it, I'm going to measure it in state 1 with 100% probability. But I'm also going to measure it in state 0 with 100% probability. It's just that they'll be in different worlds. There are no more probabilities. But what does that mean? How can we, that sort of, if you like, that probabilities aren't meant to work that way. You can't have 100% of two completely contradictory outcomes. So there are problems, there about how to think about what probability means. But I think that it also, to my mind, becomes very problematic if we go beyond just taking that as a description of that particle being measured, and really start to follow this idea that actually the whole universe somehow is split, and I have split as the measurer, and there are two different me's that have made those measurements and seen different outcomes and so on. This is the way that it's often talked about, and it's done so in a way that, to my mind, owes more to science fictional ideas of splitting personalities and multiple personalities than anything that you can actually formulate a scientific theory of, or even think about in a coherent way. Because the fact is that if this is true, then it's not just true when a physicist in a laboratory makes a measurement on a particle. It is true more times than you can possibly think about. Every passing moment, every time two particles interact, and there is an outcome that is kind of classically resolved, a certain outcome, a protein does a certain thing within your cells or something. Every time that happens, then it's hard to see how you can avoid the whole world splitting. Every quantum interaction has to involve something like this. So it's not this kind of leisurely occasional splitting that we can process. It's happening. Everything is up for grabs, if you like. And if we really try to think that through, and what that means for individuality, for perception, for consciousness, it becomes very hard to see how you can even think coherently about it.
I mean, wouldn't that mean that at any point in time, there's an infinite number of possibilities and futures, and which one you access will depend on what you do?
Well, I mean, I guess it will be saying that which one you access, you have no control over. We never know when we make a measurement on this particle if we're going to be in the 1 world or the 0 world. In fact, there's fundamentally no way we can have any control over that. But it's worse than that, because I've, even in talking in those terms, I'm saying whether I will go into this world or that world. What does that mean? I will go into both of them. The me now will go into both of them. So what is this me? What is this I? We can't use those expressions anymore. They have no meaning. And, it seems a problem to me that if a scientific theory obliterates any meaning for the scientist, for the use of personal pronouns, basically, that sort of becomes a bit incoherent. But you're absolutely right that actually, it's worse than that, because there are some measurements we make where there can be literally not just a 1 or a 0 outcome, but a whole continuum of outcomes. In fact, you know, a radioactive decay is a bit like that. It happens, you know, it seems to happen by chance. A single a radioactive atom will decay at some point. And we can't say at what point. We can only say, you know, on average, that we can define a half-life and so on. But, you know, as far as we can tell, down to the Planck time, you know, there is a continuum. It could happen any time during that process. So you do have this kind of infinite, you know, infinite splittings really in that case. And that becomes then even harder to understand, you know, that there are countless numbers of infinite splittings happening every, you know, every sort of Planck time. It becomes a very hard thing to talk about coherently.
Yeah. Now, like our understanding is that physics gives rise to chemistry, and chemistry gives rise to biology. And I know you've talked about this. Can you illustrate? Are there any provable links between, you know, quantum mechanics and biology?
Well, there is this active research area called quantum biology, which looks for exactly that, to see whether there are quantum mechanical effects that have biological consequences. And normally, you know, we think that this seems unlikely at face value, because quantum mechanics, the effects of quantum mechanics are usually, we can only see them in very well controlled laboratory conditions, often at very, very low temperatures, way beyond anything that that living organisms can survive. So, you know, no one really sort of thought that this was a possibility for a long time. But actually, that we've known, you know, when we think about it in these terms, we've known that at least in some cases, there are very well established ways in which quantum mechanics can have biological effects. And that is in the way that both electrons and protons, so hydrogen ions, can be passed between molecules. And both of these, electron transfer and proton transfer, are very, very common in biochemical reactions. They happen in enzymic reactions in all sorts of ways. But both of those particles, the proton and the electron, are small enough that they feel, even in the sort of warm, you know, wet, messy conditions of the living cells, they sort of feel the effects of quantum mechanics. So what happens is you get something called quantum tunneling, where they can make, they can sort of, if you like, jump through a barrier that in classical terms, they wouldn't have enough energy to get through. And this is a very well-established phenomenon that happens, you know, in chemistry and in biochemistry, and it's been measured in enzymes that there are quantum tunneling effects on proton transfer and electron transfer. So there is one clear example where quantum mechanics is playing a role, if you like, in biology. I mean, what's not clear is that it's playing a role in the sense that somehow biological molecules have been sort of fine-tuned by evolution to take advantage of quantum tunneling. You know, that's possible, and some people think that that's the case, but we can't automatically assume that. It could just be, well, this is something that will happen, you know, regardless of what evolution does. So we don't know, but it certainly happens. But other people think that there might be other areas where in biology where quantum mechanics plays a role. One has been suggested is in photosynthesis, when a pigment molecule, a chlorophyll molecule, absorbs a photon of sunlight in a green leaf and uses that energy for photosynthesis. That energy has to then be transferred to somewhere else in the membrane of the leaves, and that happens. And it's been suggested that that transfer of energy might happen in a way that makes use of quantum mechanical effects to make it more efficient. Now, there have been a lot of arguments about whether that's the right description, and some people are adamant that it isn't. And certainly, you know, in the 10, 15 years or so since it was first proposed, I think it's become clear that it's not as simple as that, and that, you know, whether you can truly sort of describe that as a quantum mechanical process that's making use of some kind of, you know, wave properties of the electron, that's not clear. But it's possible. You know, this is one of the other areas that quantum biology is looking at. So, you know, it's a very interesting question, I think, whether there are areas of biology, particularly, we're talking about the ways that molecules behave in biology that make use of quantum mechanical effects. And the question really is, whether this is something quite general and how widespread this is, or whether it's really just sort of restricted to things like, an electron transfer and proton transfer.
Yeah. So is there a clear-cut difference between how physics and quantum physics functions in inanimate objects versus living objects, which temperatures are different, conditions are different, chemical compounds?
Well, I think fundamentally, there isn't. I mean, fundamentally, I have seen no reason to think that there is anything special about life in that sense that it has that non-living systems lack. And in fact, we see many cases where things that happen in life, we might see analogues of that in non-living systems. The way that, spontaneous patterns form in living systems, that there may be examples of that happen in non-living systems. And increasingly, it's, I think, becoming clear that we need to describe living systems in thermodynamic terms. That are the same kind of, that involve the same kind of ideas that we use to understand the thermodynamics of non-living systems, or of, ordinary chemical reactions that aren't biochemical. So, there's no, I think there's no reason to invoke anything like what used to be called, a couple of hundred years ago, the vital principle of life, some, mysterious process that applies only to living organisms. However, that said, we still don't have a good description of what it is that constitutes a living system. And we're not even sure whether my suspicion is that there will not be such a description, that there isn't, that asking what is life doesn't have a single answer. I mean, we already see, with the existence of viruses, that there are chemical systems that do operate right on the boundary of what is living and what isn't. So yeah, I think that there really is a continuum between the two, and that, nevertheless, there seems to be something special about life that arises out of these more fundamental principles that really has characteristics that, that are special and that in particular, of course, make it susceptible to evolutionary change, which is something that, we can bring about artificially in the lab or in computer simulations or so on, but that I think life really seems to embody in the natural world in ways that are very hard to see in non-living systems. So I hope that gives some sort of answer to your question.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only person I've come across of that seems to understand what life actually is was the fictional character from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, when he discovered what the spark of life is. So he put together different organs, made up a human, put life in it. But you're saying that it's not explained by the sum of the physical and chemical processes that are in place. There's still something. Is there something missing, or? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. Sadly, Victor Frankenstein didn't say what that principle was. He said he discovered it, but he never said what it was. So we will never know. No, I think what I would say is I see no reason to believe that life needs something extra, something beyond the science that we know. But at the same time, we certainly don't have a full theory or understanding of living systems at the moment. And we're creeping towards it and we're creeping towards it using the metaphors of the time, really, which in Mary Shelley's time was electricity, and electricity held the key to life, and in these times seems to be computation, and there's a lot of discussion about computation, life being a kind of computation, which I think has some validity, but I suspect too is not going to be the complete answer or supply the complete answer.
Yeah, that would be a publication in Nature magazine, I think.
would be, well, I think it would be a book, at least. I don't think you're going to get that into a Nature letter.
Now, I wanted to shift a little bit to biology. Why do you think symmetry is so prevalent in, at least in macroscopic organisms? Everything seems to be symmetrical. Two eyes, two hands, all animals, I think it's a particular way things could have turned out, but why is it that way? Why is that the only way that survived?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure that there's a good answer to it. Or certainly why there's a good answer to the fact that symmetry is so often bilateral in organisms. So, we have a left and a right side, but why don't we have, fourfold symmetry, and starfish have fivefold symmetry? It's interesting, in fact, that starfish with their fivefold symmetry evolved out of bilateral organisms. It wasn't that this was an earlier form of evolution. It was that for starfish, it turned out that 5 was a good number to have. Could that
be the minimum number of redundancies you need so that you could still function? Do you think that played a role in the evolution?
Well, I think it has more to do with the nature of the environment that we live in, and the fact that, for example, there is the symmetry of the environment is broken by gravity. So we have a top and a bottom, and it makes sense to have a top and a bottom. And if we lived in much stronger gravity, if we were flat animals, then we wouldn't have a top and bottom. It would be much more sort of laterally spread. But I think that this has proved to be a good solution for animals. Plants have a different one. Plants are full of symmetry, but it's not the bilateral symmetry that we have. There are some plants that do have bilateral symmetry, but there are others that have different structures for the way their leaves form, and the number of petals they have, and so on. So I think there are various reasons, or various arguments why symmetries of some sort can be useful, not least because you can then have modular growth. You have you know how to produce one part, and you just keep doing that again and again for several parts. But I guess it's maybe important to recognize that the bilateral symmetry that we're used to in animals like us is not the only symmetric solution that nature has alighted on.
All right. And now, being one of the very rare interdisciplinary scientists, humans to talk to, I just have to ask you this. How do you reconcile entropy with biological living organisms, which seem to be very organized, at least in their nascence or at the beginning of their being?
Well, I think that if there is to be some kind of description of what life is, this will play a part. That is to say, it will be something that describes how it is that living organisms are able to maintain, to develop and maintain organization in the face of entropy, in the face of the second law of thermodynamics, which suggests that everything must become more disorganized, if you like. But I don't think there's any big mystery in the way it does that, because life doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics. That we're generators of entropy. The fact that we're warmer than our surroundings, we're constantly shedding heat and creating entropy in our surroundings, and that's really what life does. That it wins some order at the cost of spreading entropy into the environment, and so the overall result is that entropy increases as life happens. And we know again that this isn't something unique to life either. That we see spontaneous ordering and organization in non-living systems in nature, and whenever we do, that too is one at the cost of generating entropy in the surroundings, so that the net result is always, for the universe, if you like, is always an increase in entropy. So that's one of the beautiful and surprising things that has come out from understanding non-equilibrium thermodynamics, the thermodynamics of systems like us that are out of equilibrium, that are dynamic, that are changing. The fact that if you have systems like that, then they can become ordered, they can become regular in some sense. And, you know, that is one of the characteristics of life. It's not a unique characteristic of life, but it's one of the crucial ones.
Yeah. And what's your simplest answer for the age-old question, which has been answered, but it is, why is something the color that it is? Like, why is this particular object red, grass is green?
That's a more subtle question than is sometimes recognized, because a part of that answer has to do, of course, with the light that comes off it. So, you know, the nature of the light that reflects from something is really a question of what that thing absorbs, what the molecules in it absorb from the visible spectrum. So
they absorb everything except that one color that is reflected. So what does that tell us about that substance?
Yes. So, and that, well, that depends on its chemical nature. So, you know, for example, there are some metal ions which are present in some colored things, you know, often have a tendency to absorb in certain sort of color ranges. So, you know, copper ions often absorb in the red and reflect in the blue and green, and so copper compounds are sort of bluey green. So, you know, it's certainly well understood, you know, how that happens.
That's Vulcan blood. That's why it's
exactly, and also squid blood actually is
octopus and yeah.
Yes. So that's a part of, you know, what makes color. It's the question of what light from the visible range that our eyes register, you know, which wavelengths are absorbed and which are reflected. But it's more than that, because, you know, it only becomes color in our minds. You know, there is no intrinsic color, if you like, to the light. It's just different wavelengths. Our eyes absorb that light and process that. It creates a stimulus that gets sent to our brain where colors are created and produces, you know, the particular sensation of a particular color. And what's really important to recognize is that that's not just a function of the light that our eyes receive. It's a function of many other things, of the ambient light surrounding it, and you know that our color perceptions can be changed and can be fooled in various ways. You know, there are color illusions. We can see illusory colors. So, you know, it depends on the context as well, how our brain processes color. So color is partly a physical phenomenon, and it's partly a psychological and neurological phenomenon.
I know one of your works was entitled The Invention of Color. Is that the notion it was alluding to? At how different colored substances, particularly pigments for paint, had been discovered and invented throughout the ages, and what that had done to the way that color had been used by artists. So, you know, as different colors and more colors became available to artists, more possibilities opened up to them, and they made different uses of color. So it was really looking at the history of the use of color in art through the perspective of the development of pigments. So partly through the innovations in chemistry that allowed them to be made. Yeah. And lastly, you're writing on the patterns in nature, why the natural world looks the way it does. Can you give us a brief synopsis of the punchline as to what that's about?
That's relating to this issue that I've talked about of spontaneous ordering and pattern formation. And it's really looking at that question very generally, whether in living systems or in non-living systems, and making the point that often those patterning processes that happen, particularly in systems that are out of equilibrium, that often they share similarities in very different systems. So you see the whirlpool form of a tropical cyclone, you know, is reflected in the shape of galaxies, and the spots that you see on a on a leopard might be similar to the spots that you see on a ladybird. And there are non-living systems, there are purely chemical systems you can make that also create spots in what seems to be the same sorts of ways. So it was really making the case that there seemed to be just a really small set of patterns and processes that give rise to patterns in the world, and that we see these playing out in systems that seem to have nothing to do with each other. So it's explaining, how those patterns form, where they come from.
Is it because they're all obeying the same underlying laws of physics, so they're manifesting in different environments in similar ways?
Well, in some sense, you could say it's because they're obeying the same laws of mathematics, that there are mathematical equations that you can formulate that describe this patterning process. And it just so happens that they can be applied to perhaps a system of chemicals diffusing around, or the way individual organisms in an ecosystem interact with one another to create, structures of sort of communities or of nests or something. So ultimately, it's suggesting that these are mathematical laws, and that the same mathematics happens to apply in both cases.
And to what extent does probability play a part in those?
Well, often these patterns are an interplay between chance and necessity. So, there are certain mathematical rules that set the basic pattern that you'll see, for example, whether it's spots or stripes, and then chance plays a role to perhaps introduce defects, to slightly sort of randomize those patterns, so that, for example, the spots don't form into sort of egg box-like, perfectly crystalline arrays of spots, but they're a bit jumbled. So they look a bit like that, but they're a bit disorderly. So yeah, that's really the interplay that we often see in natural systems between something that drives the sort of a drive towards regularity and the disrupting effect of randomness and noise in the environment.
Has anybody come up with like a unifying mathematical equation to kind of predict or describe all these different seemingly disparate phenomena?
Well, there's no single theory of pattern formation, or no single mathematical, equation that will describe them all. But one very general set of equations that describes, a remarkable number of patterns is one that was devised in 1952 by the British mathematician Alan Turing. And it turns out that his equations, or his patterning process, can describe patterns that form in chemicals, in animal markings, and again in sort of community structures, in ecosystems. So yeah, that's an example of the kind of general mathematical theory that can go between different areas of science.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ball. It's been great talking to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Yes, it's been fun.